Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight for another restful story from long ago. As the world outside grows still, I invite you to slow down and settle in for a soft journey through history's quieter corners. Tell me, if you'd like, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? It's a lovely thought, all of us scattered across time zones, sharing this moment. If you enjoy falling asleep to stories like this, consider subscribing. There's so much more we'll uncover together in the nights to come. This is the true story of the Black Dinner of 1440, a night that would forever change the course of Scotland and demonstrate just how far ambitious men will go to seize power. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what happened during those horrific hours at Edinburgh Castle, but why this single evening of betrayal shaped the destiny of an entire nation and inspired one of the most infamous scenes in literature centuries later. But before we dive into that blood-soaked November night, we need to understand the powder keg that was 15th century Scotland. Because this wasn't just a random act of violence. This was the culmination of years of political maneuvering, family feuds, and a kingdom teetering on the edge of chaos. Scotland in 1440 was a nation ruled by a child. King James II was barely 10 years old, which meant real power lay in the hands of regents and ambitious nobles who saw opportunity in the monarch's youth. The country was essentially split between two rival factions, each desperate to control the young king and, through him, the entire realm. On one side stood the powerful Douglas family, whose lands stretched across southern Scotland and whose military might rival that of the crown itself. On the other side were the Crichtons and the Livingstons, families equally hungry for power, but lacking the raw strength of the Douglases. At the centre of this struggle was 16-year-old William Douglas, the 6th Earl of Douglas. This wasn't just any teenage nobleman. William controlled vast territories, commanded thousands of warriors, and possessed wealth that made him arguably more powerful than the king himself. His family had a history of both serving and challenging Scottish royalty, and their loyalty was something that could never be taken for granted. William's very existence represented a threat to anyone hoping to control Scotland through the young monarch. The Douglas family's power had been built over generations of shrewd politics and strategic marriages. They owned castles throughout the borders, controlled key trade routes, and maintained their own private armies. When William's father had died years earlier, the family's influence had only grown stronger under the guidance of capable advisors who understood that their survival depended on maintaining their independence from royal control. But William Douglas had one critical weakness: his youth. At 16, he possessed all the titles, wealth, and theoretical power of his position, but he lacked the experience and cunning of older political players. He trusted in the traditional bonds of hospitality and honour that were supposed to govern relationships between nobles. He believed that his status as Earl of Douglas afforded him certain protections, certain guarantees of safety that even his enemies would respect. This naive trust would prove to be his downfall. The man orchestrating the plot against young William was Sir William Crichton, the Chancellor of Scotland and keeper of Edinburgh Castle. Crichton was everything that William Douglas was not: older, more experienced, and utterly ruthless in his pursuit of power. He understood that as long as the Douglas family remained strong, his own influence over the young king would be limited. The Douglases had to be neutralized, but they were too powerful to attack directly through conventional means. Crichton's solution was as brilliant as it was horrifying. He would use the ancient laws of hospitality against his enemies. In medieval Scotland, there were few bonds more sacred than the protection owed to guests who had been invited to share a meal. To betray someone under your roof, someone who had accepted your hospitality, was considered one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. It was precisely because this protection was so universally respected that Crichton knew his plan would work. The invitation, when it came, seemed perfectly reasonable. King James II, now approaching his 11th birthday, wished to meet with the Earl of Douglas and his younger brother David. The meeting would take place at Edinburgh Castle, and the boys would be honoured guests at a great feast. For the Douglas family, this appeared to be an opportunity to strengthen their relationship with the crown and perhaps secure even greater influence over the young monarch. William Douglas's advisors were divided. Some urged caution, pointing out that the political situation in Scotland remained volatile and that Crichton could not be trusted. Others argued that refusing the king's invitation would be seen as an act of defiance that could justify military action against the Douglas lands. The debate continued for days, but ultimately the decision came down to William himself. The 16-year-old Earl made the choice that would seal his fate. He would accept the invitation and travel to Edinburgh Castle. Perhaps he believed his youth would protect him, that even his enemies would not dare harm children. Perhaps he thought his family's power was so great that no one would risk the consequences of betraying him. Or perhaps he simply couldn't imagine that men who called themselves nobles would violate the most sacred laws of hospitality and honour. Whatever his reasoning, William Douglas began the journey that would end with his death. He travelled north with his younger brother David, a boy of barely 14, and a small retinue of trusted servants and guards. The party made good time across the Scottish countryside, passing through lands that had belonged to the Douglas family for generations. Local people came out to see their Earl, some offering gifts and words of support that must have reinforced William's sense of security and importance. As the towers of Edinburgh Castle came into view, rising dramatically from their rocky perch above the city, William Douglas had no way of knowing that he was looking at his tomb. The ancient fortress had stood for centuries, its walls witness to countless political dramas and royal ceremonies. But none of those earlier events would match the treachery that was about to unfold within its great hall. The castle's defenders opened the gates with appropriate ceremony, acknowledging the high rank of their visitors. Crichton himself came forward to greet the Douglas brothers, his manner warm and welcoming. He spoke of the king's eagerness to meet them, of the great feast that had been prepared in their honour, and of the bright future that awaited Scotland under their combined leadership. Every word was carefully chosen to reinforce the illusion of safety and friendship. Young King James II was indeed present, though his role in what was to come remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire affair. At barely 11 years old, was he a willing participant in the plot against the Douglas brothers? Or was he merely a tool being manipulated by Crichton and his allies? The historical record suggests that the king had been coached on what to say and do, but whether he understood the full implications of his actions is impossible to know. The great hall of Edinburgh Castle had been decorated for the occasion, with rich tapestries hanging from the walls and tables laden with food and wine. The scene must have appeared magnificent to the young Douglas brothers, confirmation that they were being treated with the respect due to their rank and position. Other nobles were present, some genuine supporters of the Douglas family, others secret allies of Crichton, who were there to play their parts in the deadly charade. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere remained festive and welcoming. Toasts were raised to the health of the king and the prosperity of Scotland. William Douglas, relaxed by the wine and the apparent warmth of his reception, may have begun to believe that his family's relationship with the crown was indeed entering a new and more positive phase. His younger brother David, excited by the grandeur of the occasion and the attention being paid to him, probably had no sense that anything was amiss. But Crichton was carefully watching the proceedings, waiting for the perfect moment to spring his trap. The meal continued, course after course, while tension that only the conspirators could feel slowly built toward its inevitable climax. The other guests, those not privy to the plot, continued their conversations and enjoyed their food, unaware that they were about to witness an act that would shock even the hardened political players of medieval Scotland. The moment came as the final course was being served. According to the traditions of the time, this should have been when the most honoured guests received special recognition. perhaps gifts from their royal host or public acknowledgement of their loyalty and service. Instead, what happened next would forever stain the reputation of everyone present and create a legend that would echo through the centuries. The sound that broke the festive atmosphere was subtle at first, the scraping of metal against stone as servants began to clear away the dishes. But William Douglas, despite his youth, was sharp enough to notice that the servants moving around the hall were not the same ones who had been serving the meal. These men were larger, more muscular, and they moved with the purposeful stride of soldiers rather than the deferential shuffle of castle staff. It was then that the doors of the great hall began to close, not all at once, but gradually, as if by accident. First the main entrance, then the side doors, until every exit from the chamber had been sealed. The sound of heavy wooden bars sliding into place echoed off the stone walls, and conversations around the room began to falter as guests realized something was happening that had not been planned. William Douglas felt his stomach tighten with the first real stirring of fear. He glanced toward his younger brother David, who was still laughing at something one of the other young nobles had said, completely oblivious to the changing mood in the room. The Earl's hand instinctively moved toward his hip, where his sword should have been, only to remember that weapons were not permitted in the royal presence. He and his brother were completely defenseless. Sir William Crichton rose slowly from his seat at the high table, and the hall fell silent. Every eye turned toward the Chancellor as he raised his goblet, as if preparing to offer another toast. But instead of words of celebration, what came from his mouth would chill the blood of everyone present. "My lords and ladies," Crichton began, his voice carrying easily through the now silent hall, "we gather tonight not just to feast, but to address a matter of great importance to the realm of Scotland." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled nobles before settling on William Douglas. For too long, certain families have grown too powerful, too independent, too dangerous to the stability of our young king's reign. William Douglas started to rise from his seat, but found his way blocked by two of the disguised servants who had positioned themselves behind his chair. The 16-year-old Earl's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, betraying both his youth and his growing terror. "Sir William, I don't understand. We came here as guests of the king. We came in good faith." Crichton's smile was cold as winter frost. "Indeed you did, young Douglas, and that good faith will be your undoing." He gestured, and more armed men emerged from alcoves and doorways that had been concealed behind tapestries. The great hall, which moments before had been a place of celebration, now resembled a trap that had finally snapped shut. King James II, that 11-year-old boy who held the crown of Scotland, was guided to his feet by his handlers. His young face was pale, and his hands trembled as he was prompted to speak the words that had been carefully rehearsed. "William Douglas, Earl of Douglas, you and your brother stand accused of treason against the crown. You have grown too proud, too powerful, and too dangerous to be allowed to continue." The accusation hit William like a physical blow. Treason was a capital crime, punishable by death, and the charge was being levelled by the king himself. But even more shocking was the realization of how thoroughly he had been deceived. This had never been a feast in his honour. This had been an execution chamber disguised as a banquet hall. "Your Majesty," William said, his voice stronger now despite his fear, "what treason have I committed? I have served the crown faithfully. My family has bled for Scotland in countless battles. We have never raised arms against you or your royal father before you." But his words fell on deaf ears. Crichton had already given the signal, and servants began bringing forward items that made the true nature of the evening unmistakably clear. First came a wooden trencher, the kind used to serve meat at formal dinners. But this trencher bore no food. Instead, it held the severed head of a black bull, its dead eyes staring sightlessly at the horrified guests. The symbolism was unmistakable to everyone in that medieval hall. The black bull's head was an ancient Scottish symbol of death and doom, a message that the recipient's time on Earth had come to an end. It was a tradition so old that its origins were lost in the mists of Celtic antiquity, but its meaning was as clear as if Crichton had simply announced that the Douglas brothers were about to die. Young David Douglas, who had been confused by the increasingly tense atmosphere, finally understood what was happening when he saw that grisly trophy. The 14-year-old boy's face went white as parchment, and he reached desperately for his older brother's hand. "William," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the shocked murmurs of the other guests. "What does this mean? What are they going to do to us?" William Douglas drew himself up to his full height, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel for the sake of his terrified younger brother. "It means, David, that we have been betrayed by men who have no honor. But we are Douglases. We will face whatever comes with courage." The other nobles in the hall were trapped in an impossible position. Some were genuine supporters of the Douglas family who had been invited specifically so they could witness the destruction of their allies. Others were neutral parties who had expected nothing more than a pleasant evening of political networking. A few were secret supporters of Crichton, who had known what was planned, but were still shocked by the cold brutality of its execution. None of them could intervene. To speak out against what was happening would be to mark themselves as enemies of the crown and likely share the fate of the Douglas brothers. So they sat in horrified silence, watching as two boys, for that's all William and David really were, despite their titles and responsibilities, faced the prospect of imminent death. Crichton savoured the moment of complete control. He had orchestrated everything perfectly. The Douglas brothers were isolated, defenceless, and completely at his mercy. The other nobles were too terrified or too complicit to interfere. Even the young king was following his script exactly as rehearsed. The Chancellor had achieved what he had dreamed of for years: the complete destruction of the Douglas threat to his power. "The sentence," Crichton announced, "is death, to be carried out immediately as befits traitors to the crown." But William Douglas was not finished. Despite his youth, despite his terror, despite the hopelessness of his situation, he summoned the courage that had been bred into his family over generations of warfare and political struggle. "If you murder us here tonight," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "you murder guests who came to you in good faith. You violate every law of hospitality that civilized men hold sacred. You will be remembered not as servants of the crown, but as oath-breakers and murderers." His words struck home. Several of the nobles shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and even some of Crichton's own supporters looked troubled. The laws of hospitality weren't just social conventions. They were considered sacred obligations that even enemies were expected to honor. To betray guests who had accepted your invitation was to place yourself outside the bounds of civilized society. But Crichton had come too far to be deterred by appeals to conscience or tradition. "Take them," he commanded his guards. "The deed is decided." What happened next would haunt Edinburgh Castle for centuries to come. The guards moved forward, their footsteps echoing off the stone floor like a funeral march. William Douglas instinctively stepped in front of his younger brother David, a gesture both futile and heartbreaking. Here was a 16-year-old boy faced with his own death, still trying to protect someone even more vulnerable than himself. David Douglas began to weep, not the quiet tears of resignation, but the desperate sobs of a child who finally understood that no adult was coming to save him. The sound cut through the great hall like a blade, and several of the noble ladies present had to look away. Even hardened warriors among the guests found themselves struggling with what they were witnessing. But if Crichton felt any remorse, he showed none of it. The Chancellor had calculated that the shock value of murdering children would send a message throughout Scotland that no one, regardless of age or status, was beyond his reach. The psychological impact would be worth more than any military victory. Noble families across the realm would think twice before challenging his authority when they knew he was willing to spill innocent blood. The guards seized both brothers, their hands rough and impersonal. William tried to maintain his dignity, even as he was dragged from the hall, but David collapsed entirely, his legs unable to support him. The younger boy had to be carried, his cries echoing off the stone walls and mixing with the horrified gasps of the dinner guests who were being forced to watch. King James II, that 11-year-old puppet, began to cry as well. Whether from genuine distress at what he was witnessing, or simply from the overwhelming nature of the situation, tears streamed down the young monarch's face. Crichton quickly moved to comfort him, whispering reassurances that this was necessary for the good of Scotland, that strong kings sometimes had to make difficult decisions. The irony was lost on no one present. A child king being consoled for ordering the deaths of other children. The Douglas brothers were not taken far. Medieval justice was swift and brutal, and Crichton had no intention of allowing time for rescue attempts or second thoughts. They were dragged to the castle's courtyard, where a hastily constructed scaffold awaited them. The wooden platform had clearly been prepared in advance, another sign of how thoroughly this entire evening had been planned. A crowd had gathered in the courtyard, drawn by the commotion from the great hall. Castle servants, guards, and local townspeople pressed forward to witness what was happening. Word spread quickly through the narrow streets of Edinburgh that something momentous was occurring at the castle. By torchlight and under the cold November stars, hundreds of people watched as two of Scotland's most powerful nobles were led to their deaths. The executioner was already waiting, his axe freshly sharpened for the occasion. This was no common criminal being dispatched quickly and quietly. This was political theatre designed to send a message, and every detail had been choreographed for maximum impact. The man chosen to carry out the sentence was experienced in his grim trade, someone who could be counted on to perform his duty efficiently, regardless of the age of his victims. William Douglas was forced to kneel first. Even in his final moments, he tried to project strength and dignity. His last words, recorded by witnesses and passed down through the centuries, were a curse upon those who had betrayed him. "May God's judgment fall upon all who have broken faith this night," he declared, his young voice carrying across the silent courtyard. "And may the Douglas name survive to see justice done." The axe fell with a sound that seemed to echo forever in the minds of those who heard it. William Douglas, 6th Earl of Douglas, heir to one of Scotland's greatest families, died at the age of 16, his life cut short by political ambition and calculated treachery. His blood stained the wooden scaffold, a dark reminder of the price of power in medieval Scotland. David Douglas, barely 14 years old, was next. The younger boy was beyond speech by this point, his terror having robbed him of words. He could barely stand without support, and the guards had to hold him upright as the executioner prepared to complete his bloody work. The crowd watched in horrified silence as the axe claimed its second victim of the night. 2 lives ended in those brutal moments, but the consequences of the Black Dinner were only beginning. The deaths of the Douglas brothers sent shockwaves throughout Scotland that would reverberate for decades to come. Noble families who had previously felt secure in their positions suddenly realised that youth, status, and even royal invitation offered no protection against ruthless political operators like Crichton. But perhaps most importantly, the murders created a blood feud that would consume Scottish politics for generations. The Douglas family did not die with William and David. Other members of the clan survived, and they would neither forget nor forgive what had been done to their kinsmen. The quest for vengeance would drive Scottish politics for years to come, leading to battles, assassinations, and political chaos that would weaken the kingdom at a time when it could least afford internal strife. Back in the Great Hall, the dinner guests sat in stunned silence, the remains of their feast growing cold before them. Many had lost their appetite entirely, while others drank heavily, trying to numb themselves to what they had just witnessed. The black bull's head remained on its wooden trencher, a grim centerpiece that seemed to mock the civilized pretensions of the gathering. Crichton returned to the hall with blood on his hands, both literally and figuratively. He moved among the nobles with calm confidence, accepting their stammered congratulations and assuring them that Scotland was now safer with the Douglas threat eliminated. But his eyes betrayed a wariness that had not been there before. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and he knew that his actions would make him enemies throughout the realm. The young king was quickly escorted from the hall and put to bed, but sleep would not come easily to James II that night. The image of the Douglas brothers being dragged away would haunt his dreams for years to come. Some historians argue that this traumatic experience shaped his character as an adult ruler, making him both more ruthless and more paranoid than he might otherwise have been. As news of the Black Dinner spread beyond Edinburgh Castle, reactions varied wildly depending on political allegiances. Crichton's supporters praised his decisive action in eliminating a threat to royal authority. They argued that the Douglas family had grown too powerful and that their elimination was necessary for the stability of the realm. Some even suggested that William Douglas had been planning a rebellion and that Crichton had simply struck first. But others were horrified by the violation of hospitality laws and the murder of children. Religious leaders condemned the killings as an affront to Christian morality. Many nobles began to question whether any of them were truly safe if the Chancellor was willing to resort to such extreme measures. The bonds of trust that held medieval society together had been severely damaged. The Douglas clan's remaining members received the news with a mixture of grief and rage that would fuel their actions for years to come. James Douglas, known as the Ninth Earl after his nephew's deaths, swore a solemn oath of vengeance against all who had participated in the Black Dinner. He began gathering supporters and resources for what he knew would be a long and bloody campaign to restore his family's honour. The political landscape of Scotland had been fundamentally altered in the space of a single evening. Where once there had been an uneasy balance between competing factions, now there was open warfare between the forces of the Crown, represented by Crichton and his allies, and the surviving Douglas supporters who sought revenge for the murdered boys. This conflict would dominate Scottish politics for the next several years, leading to battles, sieges, and political machinations that would make the Black Dinner seem like merely the opening move in a much larger game. Towns and castles changed hands repeatedly as the two sides fought for control. Ordinary Scottish people found themselves caught in the middle of a war that had been sparked by the murder of two teenagers. The international implications were equally significant. Scotland's neighbours, particularly England, watched the internal chaos with great interest. Our weakened Scotland was advantageous to English interests, and there were whispers that English gold had helped finance some of the political manoeuvring that led to the Black Dinner. Whether or not this was true, the resulting civil strife certainly benefited Scotland's enemies. Meanwhile, the legend of the Black Dinner began to take shape in the popular imagination. Bards and storytellers carried the tale throughout Scotland and beyond, each telling adding new details and embellishments. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of political ambition and the importance of honouring sacred obligations like hospitality. The dinner itself became a symbol of treachery that would be referenced in Scottish culture for centuries to come. Writers and poets would use it as shorthand for the ultimate betrayal, and the image of the black bull's head would become permanently associated with doom and death in Scottish folklore. The phrase Black Dinner entered the language as a term for any gathering that ended in betrayal or violence. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Black Dinner was on the institution of monarchy itself in Scotland. The young King James II had been made complicit in an act of shocking brutality, and this would affect how future Scottish kings approached their relationships with powerful nobles. The lesson learned was that survival sometimes required ruthless action, even against children. The murders also highlighted the fundamental instability of a system where real power was held by regents and advisors, rather than the monarch himself. James II was still years away from being able to rule independently, which meant that ambitious men like Crichton would continue to manipulate royal authority for their own ends. The Black Dinner was both a symptom and a cause of this deeper political dysfunction. As winter deepened in 1440, Scotland found itself fundamentally changed by the events of that November night. The old certainties about honour, hospitality, and the protection of youth had been shattered. In their place was a new reality where political survival might require abandoning traditional moral constraints. The age of chivalry, if it had ever truly existed, was giving way to an era of calculated brutality. The castle servants who had witnessed the executions carried the story into Edinburgh's taverns and marketplaces, where it spread like wildfire through the common people. Their reactions were mixed. Some were horrified by the murder of children, while others saw it as evidence that even the mighty could fall. The psychological impact on Scotland's population was profound, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that would persist for years. The ripple effects of the Black Dinner extended far beyond the blood-stained courtyard of Edinburgh Castle. In the weeks that followed, Scotland began to fracture along lines that had been drawn in the blood of two innocent boys. Every noble family in the realm was forced to choose sides, knowing that neutrality was no longer an option in this new landscape of political terror. The surviving Douglas supporters didn't wait long to begin their campaign of vengeance. Led by James Douglas, the new Earl who had inherited not just titles, but a burning desire for retribution, they began systematically targeting everyone who had been present at that fateful dinner. The first to fall was Sir Patrick Grey, a minor noble who had the misfortune of being seated near the high table when the Black Bull's head was revealed. He was found dead in his own castle just 3 weeks after the Black Dinner, his throat cut while he slept. Pinned to his chest was a piece of parchment bearing a single word written in his own blood: hospitality. The message was clear. The Douglas clan would not forget, and they would not forgive. But Crichton was far from defenceless. He had anticipated retaliation and moved quickly to consolidate his position. Royal troops were dispatched to secure key strongholds throughout southern Scotland, while trusted allies were granted lands and titles confiscated from Douglas supporters. The Chancellor understood that his survival depended on making himself indispensable to the young king and too powerful for his enemies to attack directly. One of his most effective strategies was to paint the Douglas revenge campaign as a rebellion against royal authority. Every act of violence committed by Douglas supporters was portrayed as an attack on King James himself, making it easier to justify increasingly harsh countermeasures. Villages suspected of harbouring Douglas sympathisers were burned. Men caught carrying messages between Douglas strongholds were hanged without trial. The rule of law, already weakened by the murders at Edinburgh Castle, began to collapse entirely in large parts of Scotland. The psychological warfare was just as brutal as the physical violence. Crichton made sure that stories of the Black Dinner were told in a way that emphasised his own power and ruthlessness. He wanted every potential enemy to know exactly what he was capable of, to understand that youth, noble blood, and sacred traditions offered no protection against his ambitions. The murdered Douglas brothers became symbols not of injustice, but of the fate that awaited anyone who challenged the established order. Yet this strategy came with unexpected consequences. The more Crichton emphasised his role in the murders, the more he alienated nobles who might otherwise have remained neutral. Many Scottish lords began to see him not as a protector of royal authority, but as a dangerous madman who threatened the very foundations of civilised society. If he could murder children under the protection of hospitality laws, what other boundaries might he be willing to cross? This growing unease manifested itself in subtle but significant ways. Noble families who had previously sent their sons to serve at court began finding excuses to keep them at home. Invitations to royal functions were politely declined with increasing frequency. The young king found himself increasingly isolated, surrounded by a shrinking circle of advisors whose loyalty was motivated more by fear than genuine devotion. The international community was also taking notice. French diplomats, who had long maintained close ties with Scotland as part of the ancient alliance against England, began expressing concerns about the stability of their northern ally. Reports from their agents painted a picture of a kingdom descending into chaos, where traditional bonds of honour and loyalty were being replaced by naked political calculation. More troubling still were the reports coming from English spies operating in Scotland. King Henry VI of England, despite his own struggles with mental illness and political instability, recognised an opportunity when he saw one. A Scotland weakened by internal strife was a Scotland that posed less threat to English interests along the border. English gold began flowing to various Scottish factions, not to support any particular side, but to ensure that the conflict continued for as long as possible. The Douglas stronghold of Threave Castle became the centre of resistance against Crichton's regime. Built on an island in the River Dee, the massive fortress was virtually impregnable to direct assault. From this base, James Douglas coordinated a campaign of guerrilla warfare that struck at Crichton's supporters throughout southern Scotland. Merchant convoys were attacked, tax collectors disappeared, and royal officials found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders. But it was the psychological dimension of this campaign that proved most effective. Douglas agents spread stories throughout Scotland about the ghosts of the murdered brothers haunting Edinburgh Castle. Servants reported seeing the spirits of William and David walking the corridors at night, their severed heads tucked under their arms, searching for their killers. Whether or not anyone actually believed these tales, they served their purpose of keeping the memory of the Black Dinner alive in the popular imagination. The young King James, now 12 years old, was deeply affected by these stories. Palace servants whispered that he suffered from terrible nightmares, often waking in the middle of the night screaming about black bulls and severed heads. His tutors reported that he had become withdrawn and suspicious, flinching whenever unexpected visitors appeared at court. The trauma of that November night was clearly taking its toll on the boy who had been forced to participate in such a horrific act. Crichton tried to shield the king from these influences, but his efforts only made the situation worse. The more he tried to control James's environment, the more obvious it became that the Chancellor, not the king, was the real power in Scotland. This realization began to eat away at James's sense of identity and purpose. What was the point of being a king if you had no real authority? What meaning did a crown have if it was merely a prop in someone else's political theatre? These questions became more pressing as James entered adolescence. At 13, he was beginning to understand the full implications of what had happened at the Black Dinner. He realized that he had been manipulated into ordering the deaths of boys not much older than himself, and the guilt was overwhelming. Some historians suggest that this guilt drove many of his later actions as an adult ruler, including his eventual break with Crichton and his attempts to restore honour to the Scottish crown. Meanwhile, the Douglas campaign of revenge was expanding beyond simple retaliation. James Douglas had begun reaching out to other noble families who had grievances against Crichton, building a coalition united not just by desire for vengeance, but by genuine concerns about the direction Scotland was heading. The Kennedys, the Flemings, the Boyds, powerful clans who had watched the Black Dinner with horror, were now ready to take active steps against its architect. This coalition faced a significant challenge in the form of public opinion. Many ordinary Scots, while horrified by the murders, were also weary of the constant violence that had followed. They wanted peace and stability, not another prolonged civil war. The Douglas supporters had to convince these people that removing Crichton was worth the cost in blood and treasure that such an effort would require. Their solution was to focus on the religious dimensions of Crichton's crimes. The violation of hospitality laws wasn't just a political transgression. It was a sin against God himself. Church leaders throughout Scotland were encouraged to preach about the sacred nature of the bonds that had been broken at Edinburgh Castle. The murdered Douglas brothers were portrayed as martyrs, innocent victims of unholy ambition. This religious framing proved remarkably effective. Scotland in the 1440s was a deeply Christian society where moral authority often trumped political power. When prominent bishops began speaking out against the Black Dinner, describing it as an affront to divine law, public opinion began to shift decisively against Crichton. Even his own supporters started to question whether they were on the right side of this conflict. The Chancellor recognised the threat posed by this religious opposition and moved to counter it. He arranged for friendly clerics to preach sermons, emphasising the importance of royal authority and the dangers of rebellion against God's anointed king. The Douglas campaign, he argued, was nothing more than treasonous violence dressed up in the language of righteousness. Those who supported it were rebels against both crown and church. But this religious war of words only intensified the broader conflict. Scotland found itself divided not just politically, but spiritually, with different factions claiming divine sanction for their actions. Churches became battlegrounds of rhetoric, while monasteries found themselves pressured to choose sides in what was increasingly seen as a holy war. The violence, meanwhile, continued to escalate. A particularly brutal incident occurred in early 1441, when Douglas raiders attacked the town of Lanark, which had declared its loyalty to Crichton. The assault began before dawn, with armed men setting fire to houses and cutting down anyone who tried to resist. By the time the sun rose, more than 60 people were dead, including to do with the political women and children who had nothing struggle consuming Scotland. The massacre at Lanark marked a turning point in the conflict. Until then, most of the violence had been directed at nobles and their immediate supporters. The deliberate targeting of civilians crossed a line that horrified even hardened warriors on both sides. Suddenly, the quest for vengeance over the Black Dinner had become something far darker and more destructive. Crichton used the Lanark massacre to great political advantage, portraying it as evidence of what Scotland could expect if the Douglas faction succeeded in their rebellion. He arranged for survivors to testify before the young king about the horrors they had witnessed, their accounts serving as powerful propaganda against his enemies. The message was clear. The Douglas quest for revenge was threatening to tear Scotland apart. Yet even as he exploited the tragedy, Crichton understood that the situation was becoming increasingly unstable. The cycle of violence unleashed by the Black Dinner was spinning out of control, threatening to destroy the very kingdom he claimed to be protecting. Reports from his agents throughout Scotland painted a grim picture of a realm sliding toward complete chaos. The economic costs were becoming impossible to ignore. Trade had virtually ceased in large parts of southern Scotland, as merchants refused to risk their goods on roads controlled by hostile forces. Tax collection had become nearly impossible in Douglas-controlled territories, depriving the royal treasury of desperately needed revenue. The Scottish currency was beginning to weaken as foreign traders lost confidence in the kingdom's stability. Perhaps most troubling of all was the impact on Scotland's military capabilities. The constant internal warfare was consuming resources and manpower that should have been directed toward defending the realm against external threats. English raiders were already beginning to probe the border defences, testing whether Scotland was too distracted by internal conflict to respond effectively to foreign aggression. The young King James was becoming increasingly aware of these broader implications. At 14, he was old enough to understand that the political games being played in his name were weakening his kingdom and threatening his subjects. The guilt he felt over the Black Dinner was now compounded by frustration at his own powerlessness to stop the violence that had followed. His relationship with Crichton was growing increasingly strained. The Chancellor still treated him like a child, making decisions without consultation and expecting blind obedience. But James was no longer the frightened 11-year-old who had been coached to order the deaths of the Douglas brothers. He was becoming a young man with his own ideas about how Scotland should be governed, and those ideas didn't always align with Crichton's vision. This tension came to a head during a council meeting in early 1442. The topic under discussion was a proposed military campaign against the Douglas stronghold at Thrieve Castle. Crichton argued that a decisive strike against the rebels' main base would end the conflict quickly and restore peace to Scotland. But James, now 15 and increasingly confident in his own judgment, questioned whether such an attack would actually solve anything. "Every time we strike at them," the young king pointed out, "they strike back twice as hard. The violence only breeds more violence. Perhaps it's time to consider whether there might be another way to end this conflict." Crichton's response revealed just how much the situation had changed since the Black Dinner. Instead of the respectful deference he had once shown to royal opinion, his reply was sharp and dismissive. "Your Majesty is young and perhaps doesn't fully understand the nature of the enemies we face. The Douglas faction will never be satisfied with anything less than complete victory. They must be crushed, not negotiated with." The exchange marked a crucial moment in Scottish history. For the first time since the Black Dinner, the young king had publicly questioned his chancellor's judgment, and Crichton had responded with barely concealed contempt. Other nobles present at the meeting took note of this shift in the relationship between monarch and minister. The absolute control that Crichton had exercised for years was finally beginning to crack. Word of this confrontation spread quickly throughout the Scottish court and beyond. Douglas agents reported it to their leaders as evidence that the king was finally beginning to assert his independence. Neutral nobles saw it as a sign that the political balance might be shifting. Even Crichton's own supporters began to worry about whether their leader's iron grip on power was starting to weaken. The Chancellor recognized the danger and moved quickly to reassert his authority. He arranged for a series of military victories against Douglas positions, each one carefully staged to demonstrate his continued effectiveness as Scotland's protector. Royal proclamations were issued, condemning the rebels and promising harsh punishment for anyone who supported them. The machinery of government was deployed to reinforce the message that Crichton remained firmly in control. But the damage had been done. The seed of doubt about Crichton's invincibility had been planted, and it would continue to grow in the months that followed. The man who had once seemed untouchable, who had orchestrated the murder of children and emerged stronger than ever, was finally beginning to show signs of vulnerability. The Douglas faction sensed this weakness and began to intensify their efforts. New allies were recruited, including some who had previously supported Crichton, but were now having second thoughts about their allegiance. Money and weapons flowed into rebel strongholds as the campaign against the Chancellor's regime gained momentum. For the first time since the Black Dinner, it seemed possible that the architects of that terrible night might actually face consequences for their actions. As 1442 drew to a close, Scotland found itself at a crossroads. The kingdom that had been fundamentally altered by the events of that November night in 1440 was about to be transformed again. The question was whether the change would bring justice for the murdered Douglas brothers, or simply replace one form of tyranny with another. The ghosts of William and David Douglas, whether real or imagined, continued to haunt Edinburgh Castle and the conscience of a nation. Their deaths had unleashed forces that no one could fully control, setting in motion events that would reshape Scotland for generations to come. The Black Dinner, intended to solve the problem of Douglas power once and for all, had instead created problems that seemed to multiply with each passing month. Young King James, now approaching his 16th birthday, was finally beginning to understand the true cost of that night of treachery. The crown he wore had been stained with innocent blood, and the kingdom he would inherit was scarred by violence and mistrust. The boy who had been forced to participate in murder was becoming a man who would have to live with the consequences of that act for the rest of his life. But perhaps most importantly, the Black Dinner had revealed something fundamental about the nature of power in medieval Scotland. It had shown that traditional bonds of honour, hospitality, and protection were ultimately fragile things that could be broken by those ruthless enough to ignore moral constraints. The question now facing Scotland was whether a society could survive once those bonds had been severed, or whether the kingdom would tear itself apart in an endless cycle of revenge and retribution. The answer to that question would determine not just the fate of those who had participated in the Black Dinner, but the future of Scotland itself. The seeds of destruction sown on that November night in 1440 were still growing, and no one could predict what kind of harvest they would ultimately yield. The autumn of 1443 brought with it a chill that seemed to penetrate deeper than mere weather. Scotland was a nation holding its breath, waiting for the next act in a drama that had begun with the Black Dinner nearly 3 years earlier. The political landscape had shifted like sand beneath everyone's feet, and even the most experienced nobles found themselves struggling to predict which way the winds of power would blow next. King James II, now 16, and no longer the frightened child who had been manipulated into ordering executions, was finally beginning to assert himself in ways that made his handlers nervous. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual process, marked by small acts of defiance that grew bolder with each passing month. Where once he had simply nodded and agreed with whatever Crichton proposed, now he asked pointed questions that revealed an increasingly sophisticated understanding of statecraft and its consequences. The change was most evident during council meetings, where the young king had begun challenging decisions that he felt were unnecessarily harsh or counterproductive. When Crichton proposed confiscating lands from families suspected of Douglas sympathies, James questioned whether such actions would actually strengthen royal authority or simply create more enemies. When military advisors suggested launching raids against neutral territories to deny resources to the rebels, the king wondered aloud whether such tactics might drive fence-sitters into the Douglas camp. These interventions infuriated Crichton, who had grown accustomed to wielding royal authority without interference from its actual holder. The Chancellor had spent years carefully cultivating an image of himself as the indispensable protector of both king and kingdom. Now, with James asserting his own judgment, that carefully constructed narrative was beginning to crumble. The tension between monarch and minister came to a head during a particularly heated discussion about prisoner treatment. Douglas supporters captured during recent skirmishes had been subjected to increasingly brutal interrogations, with some dying under questioning. When James learned of these deaths, his reaction surprised everyone present with its intensity. "These men may be rebels," the king declared, his voice carrying a new authority that hadn't been there months earlier. "But they are still Scottish subjects. We will not win this conflict by becoming monsters ourselves. I will not have it said that my reign was built on torture and murder." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in that council chamber understood that they had just witnessed a fundamental shift in the balance of power. Crichton's face remained impassive, but those who knew him well could see the calculation behind his eyes. The boy king was becoming a problem that would need to be addressed. But James wasn't finished. Drawing himself up to his full height, he continued with words that would be remembered long after the men who heard them were dead. "Sir William, you have served this crown with dedication, and for that you have my gratitude. But you seem to have forgotten that you serve the crown, not the other way around. I am no longer a child to be guided and controlled. I am your king, and I will be treated as such." The confrontation marked a turning point, not just in the relationship between James and Crichton, but in the broader political struggle consuming Scotland. Word of the king's newfound assertiveness spread rapidly through both loyalist and rebel networks. For the Douglas faction, it represented hope that they might finally find an ally in the very person whose authority had been used to justify their persecution. For Crichton's supporters, it was a warning that their patron's grip on power might be weakening. The Chancellor's response was swift and calculated. Rather than openly challenging the king's authority, which would have been political suicide, he began working behind the scenes to undermine James's independence. Trusted advisors were placed in the king's household, ostensibly to provide guidance but actually to monitor and influence his decisions. Access to information was carefully controlled, ensuring that James received only reports that supported Crichton's version of events. More subtly, Crichton began spreading whispers about the king's mental state. The trauma of the Black Dinner, he suggested to carefully chosen confidants, had affected the young monarch more deeply than anyone realized. These episodes of defiance weren't signs of growing maturity, but symptoms of an unstable mind struggling to cope with the weight of royal responsibility. Such concerns, once planted, had a way of growing and spreading throughout the court. The Douglas leadership, meanwhile, was facing its own internal struggles. James Douglas, the ninth Earl who had inherited both title and thirst for vengeance, was proving to be a capable military leader, but a problematic political figurehead. His hatred for everyone connected to the Black Dinner burned so fiercely that it sometimes clouded his judgment about strategy and timing. More moderate voices within the Douglas faction worried that his desire for revenge might lead them into conflicts they couldn't win. One of these voices belonged to Archibald Douglas, a cousin of the murdered brothers who had managed to avoid being at Edinburgh Castle that fateful night. Unlike James Douglas, whose every action was motivated by rage and grief, Archibald approached the conflict with the cold calculation of a chess master. He understood that ultimately winning meant more than just killing their enemies. It meant positioning the Douglas family to survive and thrive in whatever Scotland emerged from this chaos. Revenge is a luxury we may not be able to afford, Archibald argued during one particularly tense family council. Every act of violence we commit in the name of William and David's memory makes it harder for us to eventually reconcile with the crown. We need to think about what comes after Crichton falls. But James Douglas would hear none of it. Reconciliation. He spat, his scarred hands clenching into fists. They murdered children under the sacred protection of hospitality. They made us watch as boys younger than some of our own sons were dragged away to die. There can be no peace with such men, no forgiveness for such crimes. The philosophical divide within the Douglas ranks reflected a broader question that was tearing at the fabric of Scottish society. How much violence was justified in pursuit of justice? At what point did the quest for vengeance become indistinguishable from the original crime? These weren't merely academic questions. They had real consequences for thousands of people caught in the crossfire of this escalating conflict. The winter of 1443 brought with it a series of events that would test these philosophical divisions in the most brutal ways possible. A Douglas raid on a supply convoy near Stirling went horribly wrong when the raiders encountered not just guards, but a group of pilgrims travelling to a nearby shrine. In the confusion and darkness, several innocent travellers were killed alongside the convoy's defenders. News of the pilgrims' deaths spread rapidly throughout Scotland, causing a wave of revulsion that crossed factional lines. These weren't soldiers or political figures. They were ordinary people whose only crime had been choosing the wrong day to travel the wrong road. Even some Douglas supporters began to question whether their cause was worth such collateral damage. Crichton seized on the incident with ruthless efficiency. Royal proclamations condemned the murderous rebels who would kill innocent pilgrims in pursuit of their treasonous goals. The victims were given elaborate state funerals, with the young king himself serving as chief mourner. Every aspect of the ceremonies was designed to reinforce the message that the Douglas faction had crossed a moral line that could never be uncrossed. The propaganda campaign was devastatingly effective. Public opinion, which had been slowly shifting against Crichton due to lingering revulsion over the Black Dinner, swung back toward the royalist cause. The Chancellor's supporters spoke of how the realm needed strong leadership to protect innocent people from rebel violence. Even neutral nobles began to worry that a Douglas victory might lead to widespread chaos and bloodshed. James Douglas was shattered by the unintended consequences of the raid. Unlike Crichton, who seemed capable of ordering violence without remorse, the Douglas leader was haunted by the knowledge that his quest for justice had led to innocent deaths. He began drinking heavily, and his subordinates noticed that he would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, screaming about ghosts and blood-stained pilgrims. This personal crisis couldn't come at a worse time for to have the Douglas cause. With their leader increasingly unreliable, the faction began to fragment as different factions pursued their own strategies. Some advocated for an all-out assault on Edinburgh Castle, arguing that only Crichton's death could end the conflict. Others pushed for a negotiated settlement that would allow the surviving Douglas family members to retain some of their lands and titles in exchange for acknowledging royal authority. The most radical faction, led by a Douglas cousin named William Douglas of Drumlanrig, proposed something that would have shocked both sides just months earlier. Why not eliminate King James himself? The boy king might be asserting his independence from Crichton, but he remained the symbol of royal authority that legitimised the Chancellor's actions. Without a monarch to hide behind, Crichton would be revealed as nothing more than an ambitious nobleman with no legitimate claim to rule Scotland. The proposal sparked the fiercest internal debate the Douglas faction had yet experienced. Traditional loyalists argued that killing an anointed king would damn them all in the eyes of God and man. Pragmatists worried that regicide would unite all their enemies against them and potentially invite foreign intervention. But the radicals pressed their case with increasing desperation, arguing that half measures had failed and only decisive action could break the cycle of violence. While the Douglas faction argued among themselves, King James was facing his own moment of crisis. The confrontation with Crichton had established his right to be heard, but it hadn't actually changed who held real power in Scotland. The Chancellor still controlled the royal army, the treasury, and the administrative machinery of government. James had authority in theory, but Crichton retained the practical means to ignore or override royal wishes. This frustrating reality became clear when James attempted to issue a royal pardon for several minor Douglas supporters who had been captured during recent fighting. The king's reasoning was sound. Showing mercy to relatively insignificant figures might encourage others to surrender and help wind down the conflict. But when the pardons were presented to Crichton for implementation, the Chancellor simply ignored them. "Your Majesty's compassion does you credit," Crichton said when James confronted him about the matter. "But these are dangerous times that require firm resolve. Perhaps when the rebellion is fully crushed, there will be opportunities for royal mercy." The response was a masterpiece of political manipulation. Crichton had managed to praise the king's intentions while completely negating his authority, all wrapped in language that made opposition seem petty and unreasonable. James understood exactly what had happened, but he also recognized that he lacked the power to force compliance with his wishes. This realization prompted the young king to begin thinking seriously about alternatives to his current situation. If he couldn't exercise real authority while surrounded by Crichton's supporters, perhaps he needed to find a way to escape their control entirely. The idea was dangerous. Any attempt to break free from his handlers would be seen as treasonous by the very men who claimed to serve him. But remaining a puppet king was becoming increasingly unbearable. The opportunity James had been waiting for came in the spring of 1444. When a seemingly routine diplomatic mission provided the perfect cover for a dramatic escape. The English court had requested a meeting to discuss border issues, and protocol demanded that the Scottish king send representatives to negotiate. Crichton, ever suspicious of his enemies, decided to lead the delegation himself, taking most of his trusted advisors with him. This left Edinburgh Castle with a significantly reduced garrison and gave James the opening he needed. Working through intermediaries he had carefully cultivated over the preceding months, the king made contact with several noble families who had grown tired of Crichton's dominance, but weren't necessarily allied with the Douglas cause. These men, led by Sir Alexander Livingston, were willing to support royal independence in exchange for political advancement under a truly sovereign monarch. The escape itself was orchestrated with remarkable precision for such a young and supposedly inexperienced king. On the night of April 15th, 1444, James simply walked out of Edinburgh Castle accompanied by a small group of trusted servants. No dramatic chase ensued because the king's absence wasn't discovered until the following morning, by which time he had already reached Stirling Castle and declared it his new seat of government. The symbolic importance of James's choice of refuge couldn't be overstated. Stirling Castle had been the traditional stronghold of Scottish kings for centuries, its commanding position on the River Forth making it nearly impregnable to attack. By establishing himself there, James was making a clear statement that he intended to rule as a real king, not as anyone's puppet. News of the royal escape sent shockwaves throughout Scotland that were felt far beyond the borders of the kingdom. In England, Henry VI's advisors immediately began calculating how they might exploit this new development in Scottish politics. French diplomats worried that their ancient ally was on the verge of complete political collapse. Even the Pope received reports about the situation and began considering whether papal intervention might be necessary to prevent a complete breakdown of Christian governance in Scotland. But nowhere was the impact felt more keenly than among the principal players in Scotland's ongoing drama. Crichton, still in England when word reached him of the king's escape, immediately abandoned the diplomatic mission and raced back towards Scotland with his small entourage. The Chancellor understood that his entire power structure had just collapsed overnight. Without control of the king's person, he had no legitimate claim to royal authority. The Douglas faction was equally stunned, but for different reasons. James's escape represented an opportunity they had never dared hope for. The possibility of dealing with a king who wasn't under Crichton's direct control. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about their own goals and methods. If James was willing to break free from his handlers, what did that mean for their campaign of violent resistance? James Douglas, still struggling with guilt over the Pilgrim deaths and increasingly dependent on alcohol to cope with his psychological wounds, saw the king's escape as a divine sign. "God has delivered our enemy's greatest asset into our hands," he declared to his assembled supporters. "Now we can finally achieve justice for William and David." But Archibald Douglas, the more cautious cousin who had consistently argued for moderation, saw the situation differently. The king's escape represented not an opportunity for revenge, but a chance for reconciliation. If James was truly asserting his independence, perhaps there was a path toward ending the conflict that didn't require more bloodshed. "This changes everything," Archibald argued during an emergency council meeting at Threave Castle. "We now have the possibility of dealing with the crown directly without Crichton's interference. Perhaps it's time to consider whether our goals might be achieved through negotiation rather than continued warfare." No. The debate that followed would determine not just the Douglas family's strategy, but the future direction of Scottish politics. Some supported James Douglas's call for continued resistance, arguing that only Crichton's complete destruction could provide true justice for the murdered brothers. Others endorsed Archibald's more moderate approach, seeing an opportunity to end the conflict on terms that would allow the family to survive and possibly thrive. Meanwhile, King James was facing his own challenges in establishing his independence. The nobles who had supported his escape expected significant rewards for their loyalty, but the royal treasury was nearly empty after years of warfare and political instability. The young king found himself in the uncomfortable position of making promises he might not be able to keep to men whose continued support was essential to his survival. More pressing still was the question of military strength. Crichton retained control of most of the royal army, while the Douglas faction commanded significant forces of their own. James's position at Stirling Castle was strong defensively, but he lacked the military power to impose his will on either of the major factions currently tearing Scotland apart. The solution, when it came, demonstrated a political sophistication that surprised even the king's closest advisors. Rather than trying to fight both Crichton and the Douglas factions simultaneously, James began playing them against each other while gradually building his own independent power base. He opened secret negotiations with moderate elements in both camps, offering pardons and political advancement to anyone willing to abandon their current leaders and support genuine royal authority. The strategy was risky but brilliant. By positioning himself as the reasonable alternative to both Crichton's authoritarian rule and Douglas' vengeance, James began attracting supporters from across the political spectrum. Minor nobles who had grown tired of the constant warfare saw an opportunity to support a king who might actually bring peace to Scotland. Church leaders, horrified by the violence of recent years, threw their moral authority behind a monarch who promised to restore Christian governance to the realm. Most importantly, ordinary Scottish people began to see James as a potential saviour from the chaos that had consumed their country since the Black Dinner. Farmers whose crops had been burned by rival armies, merchants whose trade had been disrupted by constant warfare, and townspeople who lived in fear of raids and reprisals all had reasons to support a king who promised stability and justice. This groundswell of popular support gave James something that neither Crichton nor the Douglas leadership possessed: genuine legitimacy in the eyes of the Scottish people. The Chancellor might control armies, and the rebels might claim moral authority, but only the king could offer the prospect of a truly unified Scotland emerging from the ashes of civil war. Recognising this shift in public opinion, both of the major factions began making overtures to the escaped king. Crichton, despite his fury at James's betrayal, understood that his long-term survival might depend on reaching some kind of accommodation with the monarch he had tried to control. The Douglas leadership, meanwhile, saw an opportunity to achieve their goals through political means rather than continued violence. The negotiations that followed were among the most complex and delicate in Scottish history. Each side brought different strengths and weaknesses to the table, and each had legitimate grievances against the others. James held the moral authority of kingship, but lacked military power. Crichton commanded significant forces, but had lost popular support due to his role in the Black Dinner. The Douglas faction could claim to represent justice for murdered innocents, but their own violent actions had tarnished their moral standing. The breakthrough came when Archibald Douglas, acting without his cousin James's knowledge or approval, made a secret approach to the king's representatives. The moderate Douglas leader proposed a radical solution. What if the pursuit of justice for William and David Douglas didn't require Crichton's death, but rather his public acknowledgement of wrongdoing and appropriate compensation to the victim's family? The proposal was revolutionary because it offered a way to address the moral dimensions of the Black Dinner without perpetuating the cycle of violence that had consumed Scotland for nearly 4 years. Crichton would have to admit his guilt and make substantial reparations, but he would keep his life and possibly retain some political role in the kingdom. The Douglas family would receive justice and compensation, but would have to abandon their quest for blood vengeance. King James, despite his youth, immediately grasped the potential of Archibald's proposal. It offered him exactly what he needed: a way to assert his authority as the ultimate arbiter of justice in Scotland while ending the destructive conflict that was tearing his kingdom apart. More importantly, it would allow him to emerge as a true king, one who had brought peace through wisdom rather than conquest through force. But implementing such a solution would require overcoming enormous obstacles. James Douglas, consumed by grief and rage, would never willingly abandon his quest for revenge. Crichton, despite his weakened position, remained proud and might refuse to admit guilt for actions he still believed were necessary. Many of their respective supporters had invested too much blood and treasure in the conflict to accept a negotiated settlement. The king's response to these challenges revealed the political maturity he had developed during his years as a powerless observer of adult machinations. Rather than announcing a grand peace initiative that both sides could immediately reject, James began working quietly to create conditions that would make such an agreement seem inevitable. First, he used his growing influence with the church to have religious leaders throughout Scotland begin preaching about the virtues of mercy and reconciliation. These sermons, while avoiding direct mention of current political events, created a moral framework that made continued violence seem increasingly un-Christian. The message was subtle but powerful. True strength lay not in the ability to destroy one's enemies, but in the wisdom to transform them into friends. Simultaneously, James began demonstrating his own commitment to justice through a series of highly publicized actions that had nothing to do with the Douglas-Crichton conflict. Corrupt officials were dismissed and prosecuted regardless of their political affiliations. Royal resources were directed toward rebuilding communities damaged by the Civil War. Most importantly, the king made a point of personally hearing petitions from ordinary subjects who had grievances against noble families. These actions served multiple purposes. They established James as a king who truly cared about justice for all his subjects, not just powerful nobles. They demonstrated that royal authority could be exercised fairly and effectively without resort to the brutal tactics that had characterized recent Scottish politics. And they created a stark contrast between the king's constructive leadership and the destructive feuding of the major factions. The cumulative effect of these initiatives was to gradually shift the political conversation in Scotland away from questions of revenge and toward discussions of reconstruction and reconciliation. People began to imagine what peace might look like and to wonder whether the benefits of ending the conflict might outweigh the satisfaction of achieving total victory over their enemies. As summer turned to autumn in 1444, Scotland found itself at another crucial turning point. The kingdom that had been fundamentally altered by the Black Dinner was on the verge of being transformed again, but this time the change might lead toward healing rather than further destruction. The young king who had been forced to participate in murder was becoming a man who might be capable of bringing true justice to his realm. But the ghosts of William and David Douglas still haunted the corridors of power in Scotland. Their deaths had set in motion forces that couldn't easily be controlled or contained. Whether James's vision of reconciliation could overcome the legacy of that terrible November night remained to be seen. The stakes couldn't have been higher. The future of an entire kingdom hung in the balance. The boy who had once been a puppet in other men's political theatre was finally ready to take centre stage in his own right. But the play he was attempting to write, one of redemption rather than revenge, would be far more difficult to perform than the tragedy that had dominated Scottish politics since 1440. Success would require not just political skill, but the ability to convince a traumatized nation that healing was possible even after the most profound betrayals. The question now facing Scotland was whether its people were ready for such a radical departure from the cycle of violence that had defined their recent history. The answer would determine not just the fate of those who had participated in the Black Dinner, but the character of Scottish civilization for generations to come. The winter of 1444 proved to be the harshest Scotland had experienced in living memory, but the cold that gripped the land was nothing compared to the chill that settled over the hearts of those who understood how precarious the kingdom's situation had become. King James, now 17, and displaying a political acumen that would have impressed seasoned diplomats twice his age, faced a challenge that would have broken lesser men. He had to somehow convince two groups of people who had spent years trying to kill each other that their survival depended on laying down their weapons and embracing a peace that neither side truly wanted. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lady Margaret Douglas, the sister of the murdered William and David, had remained largely silent throughout the years of bloodshed that followed her brothers' deaths. Unlike her male relatives, who had channeled their grief into rage and violence, Margaret had spent her time quietly building relationships with other noble families who had lost loved ones to the ongoing conflict. Her network included both victims of Douglas raids and families destroyed by Crichton's brutal repressions. In December of 1444, Margaret made a decision that would shock both sides of the conflict. She travelled to Stirling Castle, not to demand justice or revenge, but to offer King James something far more valuable: the moral authority that came with genuine forgiveness. The meeting between the young king and the sister of his victims was conducted in absolute secrecy, with only James's most trusted advisors present to witness what transpired. What Margaret said to the king during that winter evening has never been fully recorded, but its impact was immediate and profound. According to one witness, she began by acknowledging that James himself had been a victim of the Black Dinner, a child manipulated by adults into participating in an act that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She spoke of forgiveness not as weakness, but as the only force powerful enough to break the cycle of violence that was destroying Scotland. "Your Majesty," she reportedly said, "my brothers died as children, but they would not want their deaths to turn Scotland into a graveyard. They were Douglases, and Douglas's serve Scotland first, our own interests second. If their deaths can somehow lead to peace, then perhaps they will not have died entirely in vain. James was reportedly moved to tears by her words, but more importantly, he recognized the political opportunity they represented. If the sister of the murdered boys could publicly forgive those responsible for their deaths, it would undermine the moral foundation of the Douglas War campaign. James Douglas and his supporters could no longer claim to be fighting for the honor of the dead, if the dead's own family had chosen reconciliation over revenge. But Margaret's gesture would be meaningless unless James could find a way to make Crichton accept responsibility for his actions. The Chancellor remained defiant, insisting that everything he had done had been necessary for the protection of the realm. Getting him to admit guilt would require a combination of political pressure and face-saving compromises that would test every negotiating skill James had developed. The solution came through Archbishop Kennedy of St Andrews, one of the most respected religious figures in Scotland. Kennedy had managed to maintain his moral authority throughout the years of conflict by refusing to take sides while consistently advocating for peace and reconciliation. When he offered to serve as a mediator between the various factions, all parties recognized that rejecting his intervention would be politically disastrous. Kennedy's approach was masterful in its simplicity. Rather than trying to assign blame or determine who was right and who was wrong, he focused on the practical question of how Scotland could move forward. He organized a series of private meetings with each faction's leaders, not to negotiate specific terms, but to help them understand the true cost of continued conflict. To Crichton, he presented detailed reports of Scotland's deteriorating international position. English armies were massing along the border, taking advantage of Scottish weakness to prepare for a major invasion. French support was wavering as King Charles VII grew tired of backing an ally that seemed incapable of governing itself. The papal court was considering whether to declare Scotland a failed state and authorise foreign intervention to restore Christian order. To James Douglas, Kennedy offered something even more devastating: evidence of what continued warfare was doing to the people he claimed to be protecting. Entire villages in Douglas territories had been abandoned as families fled the constant violence. Children were growing up without education or religious instruction because schools and churches had been destroyed. The very people whose honour the Douglas faction claimed to be defending were being destroyed by the methods used in that defence. To King James, the Archbishop presented the most sobering assessment of all. The young king's attempt to establish independent authority was succeeding, but it was happening in the context of a kingdom that might not survive much longer. Without peace, Scotland would either be conquered by England or simply collapse into complete anarchy. Royal authority would be meaningless in a country that had ceased to exist as a coherent political entity. These private consultations continued throughout the winter months, with Kennedy gradually building consensus around the idea that some kind of settlement was not just desirable, but absolutely necessary for Scotland's survival. The breakthrough came when each faction's leaders privately admitted to the Archbishop that they were willing to consider compromises that they could never publicly propose without losing face among their own supporters. Crichton was prepared to make substantial concessions, including formal acknowledgement that the Black Dinner had violated sacred laws of hospitality, but only if he could maintain some role in government and keep his life. James Douglas was willing to abandon his quest for blood vengeance, but only if Crichton's admission of guilt was public and accompanied by meaningful reparations to the Douglas family. King James was prepared to grant pardons to all parties, but only if both sides accepted his ultimate authority as the arbiter of justice in Scotland. Kennedy's genius lay in recognizing that these positions, while seemingly incompatible, actually contained the elements of a workable agreement. What was needed was a ceremony that would allow each side to achieve their core objectives, while giving them face-saving explanations for their supporters. The result was one of the most elaborate political rituals in Scottish history: the Reconciliation of Stirling. Planned for Easter Sunday 1445, The ceremony was designed to transform political necessity into religious obligation. All three leaders would appear before a gathering of Scotland's most important nobles and clerics, not as enemies seeking advantage, but as Christian men seeking forgiveness and redemption. The religious framework would provide cover for concessions that might otherwise seem like weakness or betrayal. The weeks leading up to the ceremony were filled with frantic behind-the-scenes negotiations, as each side tried to maximize their gains while minimizing their losses. Crichton's supporters demanded guarantees that their leader would not be executed or imprisoned after making his public confession. Douglas partisans insisted that the reparations offered to their family be substantial enough to demonstrate genuine remorse. James's advisors worked to ensure that the king's role as the ultimate authority would be clearly established without humiliating the other participants. The most delicate negotiations involved the specific language that Crichton would use in his public acknowledgement of responsibility. Every word was debated and revised multiple times, with the final version crafted to satisfy the Douglas demand for admission of guilt, while allowing Crichton to maintain that his actions had been motivated by genuine concern for Scotland's welfare. The result was a statement that managed to be both an apology and a justification, a masterpiece of political ambiguity that gave everyone something they needed. As Easter approached, Scotland held its breath. The ceremony at Stirling would either mark the beginning of genuine peace or the spectacular failure of the most ambitious diplomatic initiative in the kingdom's recent history. Failure would mean not just the continuation of civil war, but the complete collapse of royal authority and the probable disintegration of Scotland as an independent nation. The morning of Easter Sunday dawned clear and bright, which superstitious observers took as a favourable omen for the proceedings. Stirling Castle had been decorated with banners representing not just the major factions, but all the noble families of Scotland, symbolising the kingdom's hope for national unity. The Great Hall had been arranged to emphasise religious rather than political themes, with crosses and religious imagery far more prominent than heraldic symbols or weapons. King James, now 18 and carrying himself with the dignity of a man rather than the uncertainty of a boy, entered the hall wearing robes that deliberately evoked both royal authority and Christian humility. The symbolism was unmistakable. Here was a monarch who ruled by divine right but acknowledged his responsibility to God and his subjects. His bearing was calm but determined, projecting confidence in the righteousness of what was about to unfold. Crichton arrived accompanied by a small entourage of supporters, but his isolation was obvious to everyone present. The man who had once commanded absolute power now appeared diminished, not just politically but physically. The years of constant warfare and political manoeuvring had taken their toll, leaving him looking older than his years and somehow smaller than his reputation. Yet he maintained his dignity, understanding that how he conducted himself during this ceremony would determine his place in history. The Douglas delegation was led not by James Douglas, whose drinking had made him increasingly unreliable, but by Archibald Douglas and Lady Margaret. This choice was itself significant, representing the triumph of the moderate faction within the Douglas family over those who had demanded nothing less than complete vengeance. Margaret's presence was particularly powerful, serving as a living reminder of the human cost of the Black Dinner, while simultaneously embodying the possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation. Archbishop Kennedy began the ceremony with a lengthy sermon about the Christian virtues of mercy, forgiveness, and reconciliation. His words were carefully chosen to provide religious justification for what might otherwise seem like political expediency. He spoke of how even the worst sins could be forgiven through genuine repentance, and how the greatest leaders were those who chose peace over victory when the welfare of their people was at stake. The first formal act was King James's declaration of royal authority over all aspects of the proceedings. Speaking in a voice that carried throughout the hall, he announced that as God's anointed representative in Scotland, he was taking personal responsibility for ensuring that justice was done while mercy was shown. This wasn't just political theatre. It was James asserting his independence from all factions and establishing himself as the ultimate arbitrator of Scottish affairs. Crichton's moment came next, and the hall fell completely silent as the former Chancellor rose to speak. His voice was steady, but subdued as he began the carefully crafted statement that had been negotiated over so many weeks. He acknowledged that the events of November 1440 had violated sacred laws of hospitality and resulted in the deaths of innocent young men. He expressed regret for the pain caused to the Douglas family and accepted responsibility for his role in the tragedy. But crucially, Crichton also maintained that his actions had been motivated by genuine concern for Scotland's stability and the young king's safety. He portrayed himself not as a monster who had murdered children for personal gain, but as a flawed man who had made terrible decisions while trying to serve what he believed were the kingdom's best interests. It was an apology that preserved his dignity while acknowledging his guilt, exactly what the delicate negotiations had been designed to achieve. The Douglas response was delivered by Lady Margaret, whose words carried emotional weight that no male relative could have matched. She formally accepted Crichton's expression of regret and acknowledged his claim that he had acted from misguided patriotism rather than pure malice. More importantly, she publicly forgave him in the name of her murdered brothers, declaring that William and David would have wanted their deaths to lead to peace rather than perpetual warfare. Her forgiveness was not unconditional, however. She detailed the reparations that Crichton would provide to the Douglas family, including significant financial compensation and the return of lands that had been confiscated during the years of conflict. These concessions were presented not as punishment, but as Crichton's voluntary attempt to demonstrate the sincerity of his repentance and his commitment to healing the wounds he had helped create. King James then announced his own contribution to the reconciliation, a general amnesty for all participants in the conflicts that had followed the Black Dinner. Men who had killed in the name of the Crown or the Douglas cause would not face prosecution, provided they accepted the new peace and swore loyalty to royal authority. It was a pragmatic decision that recognized the impossibility of achieving perfect justice while still offering the possibility of a fresh start for Scotland. The ceremony concluded with all three leaders kneeling together before the altar of Stirling's chapel, symbolically placing their reconciliation under divine protection. They swore sacred oaths to maintain the peace they had just negotiated and to work together for Scotland's welfare. The image of former enemies praying side by side was powerful enough to move many witnesses to tears and would be remembered long after the specific terms of their agreement were forgotten. But even as the formal ceremony concluded successfully, everyone involved understood that the real test would come in the months and years that followed. Public rituals were one thing. The practical business of governing a traumatized kingdom was quite another. The three leaders who had just sworn to work together had fundamentally different visions of what Scotland should become, and their followers included many who remained deeply suspicious of former enemies. The immediate aftermath of the reconciliation of Stirling was cautiously positive. Noble families throughout Scotland began returning to their estates, confident that the constant warfare was finally ending. Trade routes reopened as merchants felt safe to travel without armed escorts. Churches that had been abandoned during the fighting were restored and rededicated, symbolizing the kingdom's spiritual as well as political renewal. King James moved quickly to consolidate his authority, while the momentum of the Easter ceremony remained strong. He established a new royal council that included representatives from all the major factions, ensuring that former enemies would have to work together on a daily basis. More importantly, he began implementing policies designed to address the root causes of Scotland's instability, including legal reforms that would prevent future abuses of power and economic initiatives aimed at rebuilding the war-torn kingdom. Crichton, true to his word, began transferring the promised reparations to the Douglas family, while simultaneously working to rebuild his own political position within the new order. He accepted a reduced role in government, serving as an advisor to the king rather than wielding independent authority. His supporters, many of whom had expected him to be executed or exiled, gradually began to accept that the new arrangement might actually serve their interests better than continued warfare. The Douglas family faced perhaps the greatest challenge in adapting to the new reality. For nearly 5 years, their identity had been defined by their quest for vengeance against the architects of the Black Dinner. Now they had to transform themselves from rebels seeking justice into loyal subjects supporting royal authority. The psychological adjustment was enormous, and not all Douglas supporters were able to make it successfully. James Douglas, the 9th Earl who had led the family's military campaign, struggled most of all with the new reality. His drinking had worsened during the negotiations, and he found it almost impossible to accept that the men responsible for his cousin's murders would be allowed to live and even retain some political influence. The Easter ceremony had been conducted while he was too drunk to attend, and he spent the following months in increasingly bitter isolation. His cousin Archibald, who had played such a crucial role in making the reconciliation possible, gradually assumed leadership of the Douglas interests. Unlike James, whose grief had turned into self-destructive rage, Archibald understood that the family's survival depended on adapting to the new political reality. He worked closely with King James to ensure that the Douglas name would be associated with loyalty and service rather than rebellion and revenge. Lady Margaret emerged as perhaps the most transformed figure of all. Her act of forgiveness had made her a national symbol of Christian virtue and political wisdom. She used her newfound influence to advocate for policies that would help Scotland heal from its years of trauma, including support for war widows and orphans, restoration of damaged churches and schools, and legal protections for non-combatants in any future conflicts. The success of the reconciliation of Stirling sent shockwaves far beyond Scotland's borders. In England, Henry VI's advisors watched nervously as their northern neighbour began to stabilise under effective leadership. The opportunity for easy conquest that had seemed so promising just months earlier was rapidly disappearing as Scotland unified behind King James. English plans for invasion were quietly shelved as diplomats began exploring whether accommodation might be preferable to confrontation. French observers were equally surprised, but far more pleased by developments in Scotland. The ancient alliance between the two kingdoms had been strained by years of Scottish instability, but now there was hope that Scotland might once again become a reliable partner against English expansion. French gold and military advisors began flowing north again, helping James consolidate his authority and rebuild Scotland's defensive capabilities. Even the papal court took notice of the remarkable transformation occurring in Scotland. Pope Nicholas V, who had been considering whether to authorize foreign intervention to restore Christian order to the kingdom, instead praised King James as an example of how young rulers could bring peace through wisdom rather than conquest through force. The reconciliation ceremony was held up as a model for resolving conflicts in other parts of Christendom. But perhaps the most significant impact was on Scotland itself, where the successful reconciliation began to heal wounds that had seemed permanent just months earlier. Villages that had been abandoned during the fighting were repopulated as families felt safe to return home. Markets that had been closed for years reopened as trade resumed throughout the kingdom. Most importantly, a new generation of Scottish children began growing up in peace rather than constant warfare. The Black Dinner had not been forgotten. It could never be forgotten, but its meaning had been transformed. Instead of serving as justification for endless cycles of revenge, it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked political ambition. The deaths of William and David Douglas were still mourned, but they were now remembered as martyrs whose sacrifice had ultimately led to a stronger, more just Scotland. King James, now recognised as one of the most effective young rulers in Europe, used his success to begin addressing other long-standing problems facing his kingdom. Border defences were strengthened to deter English raids. The legal system was reformed to prevent future abuses of power. Economic policies were implemented to encourage trade and development. Scotland was not just healing from its recent trauma, it was becoming stronger than it had been before the crisis began. The ghosts of the Black Dinner still walked the corridors of Edinburgh Castle, but they no longer seemed to cry out for vengeance. Instead, they appeared to whisper of redemption, of how even the worst betrayals could ultimately lead to wisdom and justice. The boy king who had been forced to order executions had become a man capable of bringing true peace to his realm. As 1445 drew to a close, Scotland stood transformed. The kingdom that had seemed on the verge of collapse just 2 years earlier was now a model of effective governance and national unity. The reconciliation that had seemed impossible in the aftermath of the Black Dinner had not only occurred, but had created a stronger foundation for Scotland's future than had existed before the crisis began. The lesson was clear. Even the darkest chapters in a nation's history could be transformed into sources of wisdom and strength, provided leaders were willing to choose healing over hatred, reconciliation over revenge. Scotland had learned that lesson at enormous cost, but having learned it, the kingdom was positioned to face whatever challenges the future might bring, with confidence and unity. The Black Dinner would never be forgotten, but its legacy had been forever changed. Instead of serving as a symbol of political treachery and innocent suffering, it had become proof that even the most profound betrayals could ultimately lead to justice, mercy, and lasting peace. The boys who had died in that Edinburgh courtyard had not died in vain. Their sacrifice had helped birth a stronger, wiser Scotland that would endure for centuries to come. The transformation of Scotland following the reconciliation of Stirling was remarkable, but it came with unexpected complications that tested the very foundations of the peace King James had worked so hard to achieve. By the autumn of 1445, reports began reaching the royal court of a disturbing phenomenon occurring throughout the kingdom. In villages and towns across Scotland, people were claiming to see the spirits of William and David Douglas walking among the living, not as vengeful ghosts seeking retribution, but as benevolent protectors watching over the realm. These sightings followed a curious pattern. A farmer in Galloway reported seeing 2 young men in fine clothes helping to repair a bridge that had been destroyed during the Civil War. When he approached to thank them, they smiled and vanished into the morning mist. A merchant travelling near the border claimed that 2 boys had warned him of English raiders hiding in a nearby forest, saving his caravan from certain destruction. Most remarkably, several witnesses in Edinburgh swore they had seen the Douglas brothers standing guard outside the homes of families struggling with poverty or illness, their presence somehow bringing comfort and hope to those in despair. King James initially dismissed these reports as manifestations of collective guilt and wishful thinking. A traumatized population, he reasoned, was creating supernatural explanations for the healing that was occurring naturally throughout Scotland. But as the sightings multiplied and became more detailed, even the most rational minds began to wonder whether something genuinely extraordinary was happening in the kingdom. The phenomenon reached a climax during the Feast of All Saints in November 1445, exactly 5 years after the Black Dinner. In what would become known as the Night of the White Stags, hundreds of people across Scotland reported seeing 2 magnificent white deer walking through their communities, pausing to look directly at observers before continuing on their mysterious journey. The symbolism was unmistakable to anyone familiar with Celtic traditions. White stags were harbingers of divine favour, signs that the land had been blessed and purified. Archbishop Kennedy, ever the pragmatist despite his deep religious convictions, recognised the political value of these supernatural occurrences regardless of their ultimate reality. He began incorporating references to the Douglas spirits into his sermons, portraying their peaceful manifestations as evidence that God approved of the reconciliation and that the murdered brothers had found rest in the knowledge that their deaths had led to Scotland's renewal. But not everyone was comforted by these ghostly visitations. Sir William Crichton, despite his public reconciliation and apparent acceptance of his reduced circumstances, was reportedly haunted by nightmares in which the Douglas brothers appeared to him not as forgiving spirits, but as accusers demanding a final accounting for his crimes. Servants at his castle near Edinburgh whispered that their master would sometimes wake screaming in the middle of the night, claiming that ghostly voices were calling his name from the darkness. These psychological torments began to affect Crichton's behaviour in ways that concerned both his supporters and his former enemies. The man who had once been Scotland's most calculating politician became increasingly erratic and paranoid. He would change his travel routes without explanation, claiming that he sensed danger in perfectly safe locations. He began refusing to eat food that hadn't been prepared by his most trusted servants, convinced that his enemies were trying to poison him despite the formal peace that had been established. King James watched these developments with growing alarm. The reconciliation he had orchestrated depended on all parties maintaining their psychological stability and political reliability. If Crichton suffered a complete mental breakdown, it could destabilise the entire arrangement and potentially reignite the conflicts that had nearly destroyed Scotland. The young king found himself in the peculiar position of needing to protect the mental health of a man he had every reason to despise. The solution came from an unexpected source: Lady Margaret Douglas, whose act of forgiveness had been central to the reconciliation process. Despite having every reason to enjoy Crichton's suffering, she recognised that his psychological collapse would serve no one's interests. In a gesture that amazed even her own family, she requested a private audience with the former Chancellor to discuss what she diplomatically termed his spiritual difficulties. The meeting between Margaret and Crichton took place in the neutral setting of a monastery near Stirling, with Archbishop Kennedy serving as mediator. What transpired during their conversation was never fully recorded, but witnesses reported that both participants emerged visibly moved by the encounter. Crichton appeared calmer and more focused than he had been in months, while Margaret seemed to have found a deeper sense of peace regarding her brother's deaths. In the weeks that followed, Crichton's behaviour stabilised dramatically. The nightmares that had plagued him ceased, and he began participating more effectively in the royal council meetings where former enemies were learning to work together. When asked about his transformation, he would only say that Lady Margaret had helped him understand something important about the nature of forgiveness and redemption. This personal reconciliation between the architect of the Black Dinner and the sister of its victims became a powerful symbol throughout Scotland of the possibility of genuine healing, even after the most profound betrayals. If Margaret Douglas could find it in her heart to help the man who had ordered her brother's deaths, then perhaps any wound could eventually be healed through patience, wisdom, and grace. The psychological transformation of Scotland's leadership was mirrored by practical changes throughout the kingdom. The royal administration that King James was building differed fundamentally from the system that had existed before the Black Dinner. Instead of concentrating power in the hands of a few dominant figures, the new government deliberately distributed authority among multiple advisors and councils, making it nearly impossible for any single individual to accumulate the kind of unchecked power that had made Crichton's tyranny possible. Legal reforms were equally significant. New laws explicitly protected the rights of guests and visitors, making violations of hospitality capital crimes that could be prosecuted even against the most powerful nobles. Courts were established to hear complaints against royal officials, ensuring that future Crichtons would face legal consequences for their abuses. Most importantly, detailed records were required for all significant government decisions, creating a paper trail that would make secret conspiracies far more difficult to organise and execute. These institutional changes were supported by cultural shifts that ran even deeper than legal modifications. The Black Dinner had shattered traditional assumptions about honour, loyalty, and the bonds that held Scottish society together. In rebuilding their kingdom, the Scots were forced to articulate explicitly values that had previously been taken for granted. The result was a more conscious and deliberate approach to governance that emphasised accountability, transparency, and the protection of individual rights. Education became a particular priority for King James, who understood that preventing future tragedies required creating a more informed and morally grounded population. Schools were established in towns throughout Scotland, with curricula that emphasised not just basic literacy and mathematics, but moral philosophy and the principles of just governance. Children learned about the Black Dinner not as a source of shame, but as a cautionary tale about the importance of ethical leadership and civic responsibility. The Church played a crucial role in this educational renaissance, with priests and monks serving as teachers in communities that couldn't afford secular instructors. Religious instruction was expanded to include detailed discussions of Christian ethics applied to political situations, helping ordinary Scots understand their rights and responsibilities as subjects in a just kingdom. The goal was to create a population that would recognise and resist future attempts at tyrannical rule. These domestic reforms were accompanied by significant changes in Scotland's international relationships. King James had learned from the Black Dinner crisis that internal weakness invited external interference. He began building stronger diplomatic ties with European powers, not just to secure military alliances, but to create economic partnerships that would make Scotland more prosperous and therefore more stable. Trade agreements were negotiated with Flemish cities, opening new markets for Scottish wool and agricultural products. Cultural exchanges were arranged with French universities, allowing Scottish students to study abroad while bringing foreign scholars to teach in Scotland. Most importantly, the kingdom began developing its own manufacturing capabilities, reducing dependence on imported goods and creating domestic industries that provided employment and generated wealth. The success of these initiatives was evident in Scotland's rapid economic recovery. By 1446, tax revenues had returned to pre-Civil War levels despite significant reductions in tax rates. Population growth resumed as people felt confident about the kingdom's stability. Most tellingly, Scottish merchants began investing in long-term projects like ships and mills, demonstrating their faith in the country's future prosperity. But perhaps the most significant change was in the character of Scottish political culture itself. The generation that had lived through the Black Dinner and its aftermath had learned hard lessons about the fragility of civilized society and the importance of moral constraints on political ambition. These lessons were being passed down to their children, creating a new cohort of leaders who understood that true strength lay not in the ability to dominate others, but in the wisdom to build institutions that could survive individual failings. This cultural transformation was visible in the way young nobles conducted themselves at court. Instead of the cutthroat competition that had characterized earlier eras, there was a new emphasis on collaboration and mutual respect. Ambitious young men still sought power and influence, but they did so within ethical frameworks that prioritized service to the realm over personal advancement. The idea that political success required moral compromise was being replaced by the conviction that lasting achievement demanded moral excellence. King James himself embodied this new approach to leadership. At 19, he was already being hailed as one of Europe's most effective monarchs. But his success came not from fear or manipulation, but from his to inspire genuine loyalty and cooperation among his subjects. He had learned to wield authority in ways that enhanced rather than diminished the dignity of those who served under him. The king's marriage negotiations provided a perfect example of this new style of leadership. Instead of simply accepting whatever alliance his advisors recommended, James insisted on personally meeting potential brides and ensuring that any marriage would be based on mutual respect and compatibility as well as political advantage. When he eventually chose Mary of Guelders, a Dutch princess known for her intelligence and strong character, the decision was applauded throughout Scotland as evidence of their king's wisdom and integrity. The royal wedding in 1449 became a celebration not just of the royal couple, but of Scotland's remarkable transformation since the dark days of the Black Dinner. Representatives from throughout Europe attended the ceremony, marveling at the prosperity and stability they observed in a kingdom that just a few years earlier had seemed on the verge of collapse. The contrast with Scotland's recent past was so dramatic that foreign observers struggled to believe they were visiting the same country. Yet even as Scotland celebrated its renaissance, the memory of the Black Dinner remained a sobering reminder of how quickly civilized society could collapse if moral constraints were abandoned. The restored Edinburgh Castle, where the original tragedy had occurred, was deliberately maintained as both a royal residence and a memorial to the victims of political ambition. Visitors were shown the Great Hall, where the fatal dinner had taken place, and guides explained how the events of that night had led to years of suffering that could have been avoided through wiser leadership. The black bull's head that had announced the Douglas brothers' doom was preserved in the castle's museum, not as a trophy of successful treachery, but as a warning about the consequences of abandoning honour in pursuit of power. School children on educational visits would stare at the grisly artifact while their teachers explained how a single act of betrayal had nearly destroyed their kingdom, and how the choices of individuals could affect the lives of thousands. These educational efforts were part of a broader campaign to ensure that future generations would understand both the fragility and the potential of Scottish civilization. The Black Dinner was taught not as ancient history, but as a relevant lesson about the eternal human struggles between ambition and ethics, power and responsibility, revenge and forgiveness. Students learned that the same impulses that had led to the tragedy still existed in every human heart, making vigilance against moral corruption a permanent necessity. The success of this educational approach was evident in the character of the young people who were coming of age in post-reconciliation Scotland. Unlike their parents, who had learned about the dangers of political extremism through bitter experience, this new generation had absorbed these lessons from childhood. They displayed a sophistication about ethical issues that impressed foreign visitors and gave hope that Scotland's moral renaissance would prove permanent. Religious life in Scotland also reflected the profound changes that had occurred since the Black Dinner. Churches that had been abandoned during the Civil War were not just rebuilt, but expanded and beautified in ways that reflected the kingdom's renewed prosperity and spiritual vitality. New religious orders were established with missions focused on education, charity, and the care of those traumatized by war. Most significantly, Scottish theologians began developing new approaches to Christian ethics that directly addressed the political and social issues that had led to the original crisis. These theological innovations attracted attention throughout Europe, with scholars travelling to Scotland to study how Christian principles could be applied to practical governance problems. The University of St Andrews became a centre for political theology, producing graduates who combined deep religious conviction with sophisticated understanding of statecraft. These scholar priests played crucial roles in maintaining the moral framework that supported Scotland's political stability. The success of Scotland's transformation inevitably attracted the attention of other European kingdoms, facing their own internal challenges. Delegations arrived from France, England, and the German states, seeking to understand how a nation could recover so completely from near collapse. King James welcomed these visitors, understanding that Scotland's influence would be enhanced by sharing the lessons learned from the Black Dinner crisis. These diplomatic exchanges led to the development of what became known as the Scottish model of conflict resolution. The basic principles were straightforward: acknowledge wrongdoing honestly, provide meaningful compensation to victims, create institutional safeguards against future abuses, and maintain a cultural commitment to ethical leadership. But implementing these principles required exactly the kind of moral courage and political skill that had made Scotland's recovery possible in the first place. Not every attempt to replicate Scotland's success proved effective. Some rulers tried to copy the external forms of the reconciliation process without understanding the deeper spiritual and ethical transformations that had made it work. Others found that their political cultures were too corrupted by cynicism and mistrust to support genuine reconciliation efforts. The Scottish model worked in Scotland because it built on specifically Scottish values and traditions, and its principles had to be adapted rather than simply copied to be effective elsewhere. But the basic insight that had driven Scotland's recovery, that lasting political solutions required moral as well as practical components, proved universally relevant. Even where specific Scottish innovations couldn't be transplanted directly, the example of Scotland's transformation inspired leaders throughout Europe to think more seriously about the ethical dimensions of governance and the importance of building political systems that could survive the moral failings of individual leaders. King James took particular satisfaction in these international developments, understanding that Scotland's influence was being enhanced not through military conquest or economic domination, but through moral example and intellectual leadership. The kingdom that had nearly destroyed itself through political treachery was becoming a beacon of hope for other nations struggling with similar challenges. The transformation was so complete that it sometimes seemed miraculous even to those who had lived through it. As the 1440s drew to a close, Scotland stood as perhaps the most stable and prosperous kingdom in Northern Europe. The economic recovery that had begun with the reconciliation had accelerated as confidence in the country's future grew. Population was increasing, trade was expanding, and cultural achievements were flourishing in ways that hadn't been seen for generations. Most importantly, the political system that had emerged from the ashes of the Black Dinner appeared strong enough to survive whatever challenges the future might bring. The young men and women who were assuming leadership roles throughout Scottish society carried with them lessons that their predecessors had learned through terrible suffering. They understood that political power was a sacred trust that could be betrayed only at enormous cost to civilized society, could collapse when moral constraints everyone involved. They had seen how quickly were abandoned, and they were determined to prevent such a catastrophe from occurring again. Yet they also understood that preventing future tragedies required more than good intentions. The institutional safeguards that had been built into Scotland's new political system needed constant maintenance and vigilance. The cultural values that supported ethical leadership had to be renewed in each generation through education and example. The price of civilization, they had learned, was eternal vigilance against the human tendency toward moral corruption and political extremism. The Black Dinner would never be forgotten in Scotland, but its meaning had been fundamentally transformed. Instead of serving as a source of shame and division, it had become a foundation stone for a stronger and more just society. The boys who had died in Edinburgh Castle had become martyrs, not just to political ambition, but to the possibility of redemption and renewal, even after the most profound betrayals. King James, now in his early 20s and widely regarded as one of Europe's most successful monarchs, often reflected on the strange path that had led from that terrible November night to Scotland's current prosperity. He had learned that true kingship meant not just wielding power effectively, but using that power to create conditions where justice, mercy, and human dignity could flourish. The crown he wore had been stained with innocent blood, but it had been cleansed through the patient work of reconciliation and moral reconstruction. The ghosts of William and David Douglas no longer haunted Edinburgh Castle with cries for vengeance. Instead, they seemed to whisper words of encouragement and hope, reminding all who would listen that even the darkest chapters in human history could be transformed into sources of wisdom and strength. Scotland had learned that lesson at enormous cost, but having learned it, the kingdom was prepared to face whatever challenges the future might bring with confidence born of hard-won wisdom. The transformation was not complete. It could never be complete because each generation had to choose anew between the paths of honour and ambition, justice and expedience, reconciliation and revenge. But Scotland had created institutions and cultivated values that made the right choices more likely and the consequences of wrong choices less catastrophic. The Black Dinner had taught the kingdom that civilization was fragile, but it had also demonstrated that with wisdom, courage, and moral commitment, even the most shattered societies could be rebuilt stronger than before. As Scotland entered the 1450s, the kingdom stood as living proof that the human capacity for moral growth and political wisdom could triumph over even the darkest impulses of ambition and revenge. The boys who had died as victims of political treachery had become symbols of the possibility that suffering could be transformed into strength, that betrayal could lead to deeper trust, and that even the most profound injustices could ultimately serve the cause of justice itself. The legacy of the Black Dinner extends of Scotland, ripped far beyond the border, spling through the courts and chronicles of medieval Europe like stones cast into still water. In the royal palaces of France, England, and the German states, the story was told and retold, each telling, adding new layers of meaning and interpretation. But perhaps nowhere did the tale resonate more powerfully than in the mind of a young writer named George Martin, who centuries later would draw inspiration from this very night of treachery to craft one of literature's most shocking betrayals. The Red Wedding, that fictional massacre that would horrify readers and viewers alike, bore the unmistakable DNA of the Black Dinner. The violation of guest rights, the use of a wedding feast as cover for murder, the systematic elimination of an entire family line. All these elements could be traced back to that November night in Edinburgh Castle, when two innocent boys were led to their deaths under the sacred protection of hospitality. But the real Black Dinner had consequences that no work of fiction could fully capture. The psychological trauma inflicted on King James II shaped not just his reign, but his entire approach to kingship. The boy who had been forced to participate in child murder became a man obsessed with justice and the protection of the innocent. His later policies reflected this obsession: harsh punishments for those who harmed children, unprecedented legal protections for guests and travellers, and a royal court culture that prized honour above political expediency. The king's personal transformation was mirrored by changes in Scottish legal tradition that would endure for centuries. The concept of sacred hospitality became enshrined in Scottish common law, making the murder of guests one of the most serious crimes possible. Even today, elements of these medieval protections can be found in modern Scottish legal codes, ghostly reminders of a night when the violation of hospitality nearly destroyed a kingdom. The Douglas family story didn't end with the reconciliation of 1445. The surviving members of the clan carried forward the memory of William and David not as martyrs to political ambition, but as symbols of innocence destroyed by unchecked power. This transformation of their legacy became a cornerstone of Douglas identity for generations, shaping the family's approach to politics and their relationships with the Scottish crown. Lady Margaret Douglas, whose act of forgiveness had been so crucial to Scotland's healing, lived to see her grandchildren grow up in the peaceful kingdom that her brothers' deaths had ultimately helped create. She never married, dedicating her life instead to charitable works and the education of young nobles. Her school for the children of Scottish aristocrats became famous throughout Europe for its emphasis on ethical leadership and moral philosophy. Students from as far away as Italy travelled to Scotland to learn from the woman who had transformed personal tragedy into a force for social good. The school's most famous graduate was perhaps John Knox, the religious reformer who would later play such a crucial role in Scotland's Protestant Reformation. Knox often spoke of how Lady Margaret's teachings about forgiveness and moral courage had shaped his own understanding of Christian leadership. The connection between the Black Dinner and Scotland's later religious transformation was thus not merely historical accident, but a direct line of moral influence stretching across more than a century. Sir William Crichton's final years were marked by a genuine transformation that surprised even his closest associates. The man who had once orchestrated child murder became an advocate for legal reform and the protection of the vulnerable. His private papers, discovered centuries later, revealed a tortured conscience struggling to make amends for past sins through present virtue. He established schools in remote Scottish villages, funded orphanages, and wrote extensively about the dangers of unchecked political ambition. Crichton's writings, while never published during his lifetime, circulated privately among Scottish nobles and eventually influenced the development of political theory throughout Europe. His insights into the psychology of power and the institutional safeguards necessary to prevent its abuse were remarkably sophisticated for their time. Modern historians studying medieval political thought often cite Crichton's unpublished works as early examples of systematic thinking about constitutional limitations on royal authority. The former Chancellor died in 1454, still serving on King James's royal council, but in a greatly reduced capacity. His funeral was attended by both former enemies and old allies, a testament to the genuine nature of his personal reformation. Lady Margaret Douglas delivered the eulogy, speaking movingly of how even the greatest sinners could find redemption through genuine repentance and service to others. King James himself lived until 1460, dying at the young age of 29 during the siege of Roxburgh Castle. His death came not from political assassination or the consequences of old enemies, but from a tragic accident when a cannon exploded during a military demonstration. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. The king who had brought peace to Scotland through wisdom and diplomacy died in the pursuit of military glory against foreign enemies. James's funeral became a national outpouring of grief that crossed all the old factional lines. Douglas supporters mourned alongside former Crichton loyalists, while common people throughout Scotland wept for the loss of the king who had brought them peace and prosperity. The young man, who had once been a terrified puppet in other men's political games, was remembered as one of Scotland's greatest monarchs, a ruler who had transformed personal trauma into public service. The regency that followed James's death faced the challenge of maintaining the political stability he had created while governing in the name of his 8-year-old son, James III. The lessons of the Black Dinner loomed large in the minds of those who assumed power, creating a determination to avoid the mistakes that had nearly destroyed Scotland 2 decades earlier. Multiple regents shared authority, preventing any single individual from accumulating the kind of unchecked power that had made Crichton's tyranny possible. This collective leadership model, born from the trauma of the Black Dinner, proved remarkably effective. Scotland continued to prosper under the Regency, with trade expanding, population growing, and cultural achievements flourishing. The institutional safeguards that James II had built into the Scottish political system proved strong enough to survive even the death of their architect. The story of the Black Dinner also spread beyond Scotland through the networks of medieval chroniclers and storytellers. Monks in French monasteries copied accounts of the tragedy into their historical records, often adding moral commentary about the importance of honouring sacred obligations. German minnesingers composed ballads about the murdered Douglas brothers, their songs carrying the tale throughout the Holy Roman Empire. Italian humanist scholars analysed the event as an example of how political ambition could corrupt even the most civilised societies. These international retellings of the Black Dinner story often emphasised different aspects of the tragedy depending on their audience's concerns. French versions focused on the violation of feudal obligations between lord and vassal. German tellings emphasized the religious dimensions of breaking sacred hospitality. Italian accounts analyzed the political miscalculations that had led to such devastating consequences. But all versions agreed that the event represented a fundamental violation of the moral order that governed civilized society. The Black Dinner also influenced the development of diplomatic protocol throughout medieval Europe. The idea that political enemies could be safely eliminated through the abuse of hospitality was so shocking that it prompted new international agreements about the treatment of diplomatic guests and the conduct of political negotiations. Treaties began including specific clauses protecting negotiators and their families from harm, while diplomatic immunity became more clearly defined and universally respected. These protections weren't merely theoretical. They had practical consequences that saved lives and prevented conflicts throughout the late medieval period. When tensions arose between different kingdoms, the memory of the Black Dinner served as a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of diplomatic treachery. Leaders who might have been tempted to eliminate rivals through deception we're reminded of how such actions could destabilize entire regions for decades. The religious implications of the Black Dinner continued to resonate long after the immediate political crisis had been resolved. The Catholic Church incorporated the story into its teachings about the sanctity of hospitality and the moral obligations of Christian rulers. Sermons throughout Europe referenced the tragedy as an example of how political ambition could lead to the most grievous sins. The murdered Douglas brothers were never formally canonized, but they were remembered as martyrs to Christian virtue and innocent victims of worldly corruption. Protestant reformers later used the Black Dinner as evidence of the moral corruption that they argued had infected medieval Catholicism. They pointed to the involvement of church officials in the political maneuvering that led to the tragedy as proof that religious authority had been compromised by temporal concerns. While this interpretation was historically questionable, it became part of the broader Protestant critique of Catholic political involvement and helped justify the religious upheavals of the 16th century. The Black Dinner's influence on literature extended far beyond its eventual inspiration for fictional works like The Red Wedding. Medieval romance writers incorporated elements of the story into their tales of chivalry and betrayal, often using the violation of hospitality as the ultimate act of villainous treachery. Renaissance dramatists found in the tragedy a perfect example of how personal ambition could lead to the destruction of both individuals and kingdoms. The Black Dinner stands as one of history's most chilling examples of how political ambition can corrupt the very foundations of civilized society. What began as a calculated act of treachery in 1440 ultimately became a catalyst for one of the most remarkable transformations in medieval European history. The deaths of William and David Douglas didn't just end two young lives, they sparked a chain of events that would reshape Scotland's political culture, legal system, and moral identity for centuries to come. Today, the lessons of that terrible November night continue to resonate, reminding us that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against those who would sacrifice honor for power.